Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to talk on my favorite virus, which is African swine fever virus. I hope you can all hear me. I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you in person today, but I had family commitments, 3 kids to look after and my wife in Europe, so I really couldn't leave them. But I hope that you'll be able to see the picture of me at least, so you can know what I look like. So, what I'm going to talk about today is obviously this incredibly worrying situation that we have facing us with African swine fever virus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the virus and the disease, just a small amount on the current global situation, because I think many of you are aware about that, and then go on to talk about why we're struggling to control this virus. Also, the question that everybody asks are prospects for vaccination, and then look a little bit at the future risks for the USA and what next. At the top of the slide is a paper that I wrote about 3 or 4 years ago, actually, African swine fever virus on the move and dangerous, and this has really come true. And I mentioned in this paper what a disastrous situation it would be and how inevitable to a certain extent it was that this virus would spread and would end up in China. And that's the current situation that we have. So, excuse me, just the wrong way. So, what's all the fuss about? And you guys all know this, of course. There's a massive amount of money and trade at stake with a virus like this, which is not only extremely nasty, causing very serious disease in pigs, but also if any country gets African swine fever virus, then there are severe global trade connotations. And you can see from 2007, the exporters of pork, the main exporters of pork, including obviously the USA, also including Belgium and Poland, who now have the disease, and many countries like Germany, like Denmark, like the Netherlands, like France, who are very, very much on the edge of African swine fever virus. And you guys also know that China produces over half the world's pork, and recently this virus entered China, which is a very big worry, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. So I wanted to introduce the virus because, of course, I've worked on the virus a lot in my career. And it's a very, very interesting, very large, very complicated, and very tough virus. And this is what causes the problems. We still have a lot of things to understand about the virus. It has many proteins, probably about 165 in total. And we've only looked at something like a third of these in detail. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand the biology behind this virus and how it does what it does. And the other thing that you will all know about it, how tough it is, how resistant it is in the environment, how it maintains itself in the environment, how it's very difficult to kill, even if you smoke and cure and even partially cook some pork, it sticks around. So this makes it extremely difficult to control. The other thing about African swine fever virus is there's lots of different types out there. We call them genotypes. And you can see from the map of Africa on the right, this is originally an African disease. You can see all the different colors which represent the different genotypes. There are currently around 24, although there are probably more. And you can see most of the variety of colors are in Eastern and Southern Africa, and this is where all the variation occurs, probably within a warthog burrow, through transmission of the virus between warthogs and soft ticks. But as you can see from the green dots in the past, genotype 1 has come out and has infected countries out of Africa, including the Iberian Peninsula, which had African swine fever virus for some 30 years before it was eradicated. And during that time, it spread up to Belgium and the Netherlands, and also spread to Sardinia, where it is still present. And then you see on the top and bottom right the red dot, and this is the genotype 2 of the virus, which is currently spreading, and we're going to talk a lot more about. And the virus that came up into Georgia in 2007 came from Madagascar, right down in the south on the bottom of the map. It came on a ship which came up through the Suez Canal and through the Black Sea, and then docked in the port of Poti in Georgia, and then spread out of control before it was properly diagnosed, and one would say that the virus had spread, or the horse had bolted before the door was shut, and that was part of the problem. So we have a complicated virus with different genotypes. Just a little bit on the disease. Many of you will remember this, the vets will remember it from your vet school days. It's an extremely nasty disease that basically is associated with blood and causes hemorrhage and edema. It basically damages the endothelial cells, so you get leakage of the blood. And what you get is blood coming out of all orifices, blood that infects everything within the pig, including all the organs. So these are the kinds of pictures that we want to avoid seeing when the virus spread to various islands. In Europe, this was Malta actually, but it also spread to Caribbean islands like Haiti and Dominican Republic, where most of the pigs on the islands had to be slaughtered in the end because it was such a nasty disease. As regards recognizing the virus, well, it's quite easy to recognize, although it can be confused, certainly in the early stages, with some other diseases like PRRS or like classical swine fever. What you see initially is a loss of appetite, you see recumbency, you see fever, you often get vomiting and diarrhea, which is bloody, so full of virus. And then you start to see skin hemorrhages, which start usually on the ears and then spread all over the body. And when you open these animals up, you really see multiple hemorrhages all over the body in every organ. So this is a classic picture of pigs when they're huddling together at the start of the outbreak, an outbreak of any virus. When they've got pyrexia, you'll see them huddling together. But with African swine fever virus, it starts to cause hemorrhage, usually on the extremities, especially on the ears and on the snout. And this extends to the whole of the body. And they usually survive when they're infected with high virulent viruses for about 7 to 10 days. When you open the animals up, you really see an enormous amount of destruction because of this hemorrhage. And the picture on the top left, you see the gastrohepatic lymph node, which is usually a very small lymph node which you can hardly find. And you can see here it's just like massive blood clots. The structure of the lymph nodes is completely gone. And as you can see on the top right, they are basically blood clots. You can't feel any lymph node in there, because it's completely damaged by the virus. You see hemorrhages in all the organs. These are the kidneys. And when you open the pig up, you will see this massive spleen just rolling around the top of the abdomen. And you touch that spleen and your finger will go into it. It's completely friable, dark, and extremely hemorrhagic. You see hemorrhages in the heart. You see hemorrhages in the guts. And I have to say at this stage, not all African swine fever viruses are highly virulent. The majority are, so the majority would kill an animal within like a week to 10 days. But as the virus circulates in a situation, and we've seen this in Iberia and we're now seeing it in Europe, as it circulates and continues to circulate over a matter of years, you get a changing of the virus, which viruses do, and the viruses can become moderately virulent or avirulent, non-virulent at all. And when you get these types of viruses, you see all sorts of clinical signs. You see these nasty lesions on the joints, and they become very lame, and these can become infected. And these are classic lesions you see with chronic lesions you see with moderate or low virulent isolates of African swine fever virus when they're infecting pigs. So just very briefly, we all know what happened in 2007. The virus came up on a boat through the Black Sea. It came to Potty. I was actually in charge of the ASF reference laboratory at Purbright then, and I got the call from the Georgians who said, basically they were saying that there were pigs dying in fields, lots and lots of pigs dying, and they were floating down the rivers. And they explained to me the clinical signs and the fact these pigs were red and they were dying so quickly. And I just said to the guy in Georgia, we really need to get samples to the lab at Purbright to diagnose this. They came within 24 hours, we diagnosed it. But the problem was, it had probably been present for at least weeks, if not months beforehand. So it had spread to the other Caucasian states and also spread up into Russia before it had even been properly diagnosed. So after 2007, as I say, it spread, and then in 2009 it went up to St. Petersburg in Russia, and then it spread to various areas you can see up the yellow dots, so large distances. And this was with humans, this was with pig meat being carried, and these were isolated outbreaks that were on the whole snuffed out. But what happened after that is we got this massive spread in this area. And you can see these dots, green for wild boar and blue for domestic pigs. And over 2011 to 2017, basically the virus became endemic in the wild boar populations in these northern European countries and in northern Russia. And what was actually happening in order for the virus to spread from year to year, from season to season, is it was killing wild boar. And those wild boar were likely to be frozen over the winter because they have very harsh winters in these areas. And then 3 or 4 months later, when the thaw came, those carcasses were thawed, and then they were investigated and sometimes eaten and sniffed by existing wild boar, and the virus continued from season to season. So it became pretty much endemic. It was self-perpetuating in wild boar, which it still is in those areas. And what we saw in 2007, moving over to the right, is these blue dots, these outbreaks in domestic pigs that started across Russia and moved all the way over to the Mongolian border to the right, really on the border of the People's Republic of China. And this was a real worry because we knew the problems that could happen if this virus came to China, and many people had talked about them. And yes, as we know, just a few weeks ago, for the first time we heard about the virus probably coming from Russia, although I don't think the genotyping has been done yet, but probably coming from Russia into China and spreading all down the east coast of China, in the areas of China when there's a high numbers of pigs and also a high number of backyard pigs, which we'll come to later. Also at the same time, we've been seeing a massive escalation of the outbreak in Europe, in Romania and moving into Bulgaria, where hundreds and hundreds of new outbreaks have been occurring in backyard pigs, especially in Romania. But also the virus has been spreading to some of the high biosecurity, intensively farmed pigs. And actually the second biggest pig farm in the whole of Europe, containing 140,000 pigs, got African swine fever virus just a few weeks ago, and they all had to be slaughtered. And they think that this probably came from the virus coming from the water coming into this farm, because people tend to dispose of pigs when they have they die of African swine fever virus in the rivers. And they think the water may have been contaminated with African swine fever virus. So this is a major escalation that we've seen. China is, for so many reasons, a big worry because of the nature of the farming, the nature of the backyard farms there, the nature of the fact that the environment is very conducive to wild boar being around as well. Also critically small farms, so there's very, very large areas infected. And as you've seen from August the 3rd all the way up to the 6th and beyond, because we've seen outbreaks all the way up to the present time that are occurring in China, this is something that is an incredible worry. And there's also quite a lot of speculation at the moment that the virus might have come in to China in the spring, so at least 3 months maybe before it was officially diagnosed. And this is an incredible worry because the same thing would have happened as happened in Georgia. The virus had spread before it had been properly diagnosed. So we think the same thing may have happened. As you can see in China, in the dark red here in the top map, you can see these are areas where all the pigs are in China, and you see that these are the same areas where we're having the outbreaks. Incredible amounts of pigs in these areas. The amount of live pigs sold by these 6 provinces that were affected reached 174 million of the nationally sold live pigs in 2017. So an enormous amount of pigs at risk. And then last Thursday we saw the virus spread and arrive for the first time in this little corner on the corner of Belgium and France, and very close to Germany and Luxembourg. Probably it's thought that the virus came through people again, bringing virus-contaminated products, maybe from Romania or Bulgaria, putting it down, and wild pigs getting hold of us. But we don't know. We know for certain that 5 wild boar have been found to have the virus, and we know that the area where the virus is very forested, so there's a lot of wild boar around. So this is a very, very dangerous situation again. So I wanted to talk a little bit now about how the virus is being transmitted, just very, very briefly, because I know it's not so relevant here about what happens in Africa, but it is relevant about this tick here at the bottom right. So what happens in Africa is the virus is transmitted and spreads, and it's been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's been basically very happily situated inside warthog burrows. And young warthogs are affected by Ornithodorus soft ticks, and the virus, the ticks, and the warthogs are all happy. It's only when it gets out of this situation and gets into domestic pigs that you get this severe clinical signs. And these ticks that we have both in Africa and in other areas of the country are amazing beasts. If they're infected by feeding off a pig or a warthog, they're called nidicolous ticks. So they're nest-building ticks. They can go into little crevices or warthog burrows, and they needn't have a meal for up to 5 years. And then they can come out 5 years later, and the virus will still be alive inside them, and it can infect new pigs that come in. And this is what happened in the Iberian Peninsula. So these ticks are extremely dangerous if they're around, contributing to the maintenance of the virus in the environment. So thanks to the guys at Wagenburg in Holland, in the Netherlands, for this, because it really shows nicely how the virus is transmitted both to domestic pigs and to wild boar. And transmission is associated with blood. And a pig with African swine fever virus bleeds from all its orifices, from its vomits, it's got diarrhea, it's got blood coming out of its nose, its carcass is extremely affected, so there's lots of potential for transmission. But doesn't transmit the virus by aerosol infection, so it's not as easily transmitted as, say, you would do something like maybe PRRS or foot and mouth disease. So it's a slow burner, so it starts quite slowly. But when you get, do pigs get infected, as you can see from the left? From many ways. They can be infected by direct contact with infected pigs. They can be infected with materials, contaminated materials, livestock trucks, or materials of the vet's boots, all those kind of things. They can also be infected by eating kitchen waste and food residues. They can also be infected by soft ticks if they're there. And then this interaction between the wild boar and pigs is so important, and it's so important in maintaining this virus in many of the countries that have it at the moment in Europe and beyond. And the wild boar, of course, don't respect boundaries, so they travel reasonably long distances. They can do. They're very social animals. So if one wild boar within a group gets African swine fever virus, they're going to all be very social with it. They're going to be sniffing it. They're going to be keeping close to it. And when that wild boar dies, they're going to be that carcass of that wild boar is actually full of virus. So it will potentially pass the virus on to other wild boars that come up and take a look, maybe have a nibble, or maybe sniff around. So wild boar can also be infected by materials like pigs, especially from hunters who don't disinfect their boots, etc., don't have the right biosecurity disinfection regimes. Of course, feed. People throw feed about, especially when they go for picnics, like probably may have happened in Belgium, and that feed can be infected with virus because the virus is so tough. It's very difficult to get rid of. Of course, infected wild boar can infect other boar by direct contact, and of course soft ticks. So this is what's going on in Europe, this interaction between wild boar and domestic pigs, and the wild boar are actually maintaining the virus in the environment. So there are many risk factors that we talk about. Of course, when we're dealing with pigs, as we know in the UK from the foot and mouth disease outbreaks, pigs tend to eat everything, so they tend to be an easy source of these transboundary, these exotic diseases. So there's many things that we need to take into consideration. I'll talk about some of these very briefly on their own, but there's contact between wild boar and backyard feral pigs, as we've talked about, lack of biosecurity, there's human behavior, there's a lot of social and financial issues here, lack of knowledge and information, money constraints and lack of compensation, and make farmers and people do things that they maybe shouldn't do, which are illegal, which I'll talk about in a second. There's also this aspect of surviving swine becoming carriers, long-distance movement of wild boar, And there's a lot of discussion in Europe about how hunting affects the long-distance movement of wild boar and possibly the transmission of virus over large distances. There's also the virus entering the catering cycle, as we've talked about, and the movement of humans, migrant workers with pork products. So these are all big issues that contribute to risk factors for the spread of African swine fever virus. And I'll just talk about these very briefly. Of course, there's the role of the wild boar. And as you can see from this map, this big circle here, many of the areas where we have African swine fever virus, there are plenty of wild boar. And moving in a westward direction as we go towards the red, there's more wild boar. And this virus is now spreading into areas where there's very high concentrations of wild boar, such as in Romania and in parts of Poland and Ukraine. So it's the combination of wild boar and the contact between the wild boar and the feral or the low biosecurity backyard pigs is so important. And as you can see, this shows the amount, as it gets redder, it gets more, of low biosecurity backyard or feral pigs in Europe. And you can see again, as we go westwards, we see more and more backyard pigs associated with more and more wild boar. So this is a recipe for maintaining the virus in the population. And we all thought that when the virus gets to Romania, especially because there's such a lot of wild boar and such a lot of backyard pigs, it would explode. And this is exactly what's happened and exactly what we're seeing now. A third important risk factor is the role of recovered carrier pigs. Now, when this virus first entered Georgia, it was likely to be a highly virulent virus which killed probably pretty much 100% of the pigs that it infected. But over the past 11 years, there is evidence through publication and very good work by the European Community Reference Laboratory and the Russians and others, where they're showing that pigs are actually recovering from infection. They're showing pigs and wild boar that have antibodies to the virus that are recovered. They're also showing evidence for reduction in virulence of some of the virus, so a cocktail like of viruses circulating, and some of them are low virulence and some of them are moderately virulent. And of course we all know when a virus, when an infected animal is able to recover, then and carry the virus in a recovered state is a lot more difficult to control than when an animal just dies within 7 to 10 days, and that's the end of that. So what we're seeing now is evidence in Europe of pigs recovering from infection because the virus is attenuating for one reason or another, and we've known for many years that animals or pigs and wild boar that recover from the virus are able to carry the virus for quite long lengths, a matter of months, and they are able to transmit the virus. So this brings a whole new dimension to the problem, making it far more challenging to control because we have these cocktail of viruses present. Of course, humans, the role of humans, this is such a big area. And many of the long-distance spreads that we've seen around the place, and probably the long-distance spread to Belgium and around Russia and probably to China, is all about human factors. And it's lack of information for farmers, hunters, travelers, and also, in some cases, low levels of compensation, so people can't afford to lose their pigs. So when that kind of thing happens, you get disposal of dead pigs, you get poor disposal of carcasses into rivers because it often costs to dispose of pigs. You get selling of pigs in the face of an outbreak. You get movement of sick pigs to market, which is classic when farmers see that they might have it. They're so frightened of the disease, they send the pigs to market straight away. And of course that puts these infected pigs potentially into the food chain. There's swill feeding that's carried out. There's vehicle contamination. There's a contamination through vets, farm workers and hunters. Poor levels of biosecurity. And of course carcass disposal, especially in wild boar, is so important. Rapid carcass disposal. And there has been evidence showing flies, which of course can be mechanical transmitters of this virus. So this is a really important risk factor, the human risk factor, especially when it comes to, like the USA, the virus coming into countries for the first time. So the fifth and final risk factor is the role of the tick. And as I said earlier, this tick can transmit the virus, and it also can maintain the virus in an environment for very long time periods, as it did in the Iberian Peninsula. And we can see here The presence of these Ornithodoros soft ticks in Africa. These are Ornithodoros mubata, which, as I said earlier, are transmitting the virus between warthogs and soft ticks in the sylvatic cycle. But there are other Ornithodoros species that are present. Some of them are towards around West Africa. They extend up into the Iberian Peninsula, into Spain and Portugal. And then you can see also in the States there are Ornithodoros ticks present, and there are Ornithodoros ticks present all the way across, probably into China, but we need more work at that. Now it's gone into China, we really need to look at the presence of Ornithodoros ticks because they can play such a role in the maintenance of the virus in the environment. But as you can see from this circle above, there are not thought to be Ornithodoros ticks in many of the countries that currently have African swine fever virus. But more work needs to be done in this area. So African swine fever virus, the main challenges we face. So it's a very resistant virus, as I've explained. It sticks around in pork meat, in cured meat, in smoked meat. It's a complex virus with multiple genotypes. We only have one genotype present at the moment in Europe, but there are another 23 in waiting in Africa. It's present in domestic and wild swine, which makes things extremely difficult to control because wild swine don't respect borders and they can transmit the virus around between countries. Signs and symptoms can be confused, especially at the start, with other diseases. It makes it difficult to diagnose the disease right at the start, so you lose time at the start, and it's so critical to get rapid and effective diagnosis right at the start to be able to stamp out the disease. In some parts of the world, we've got these ticks, we've got reservoirs and infection that are contributing, we've got carrier animals that are now present and as the virus attenuates, and we've got lack of effective vaccines, which I'll just mention very briefly because it's always a question people ask about why haven't we got vaccines for African swine fever virus. And of course we have rapid uncontrolled spread in developing countries. So these viruses are waiting in developing countries to come out. So, coming towards the end of my presentation now, I wanted to just talk a little bit about why no vaccine for African swine fever virus. And I've mentioned some of the reasons before. This is a very large, complex virus with many proteins, thought to be about 165. So some viruses only have like 5 proteins. This has loads of proteins, all doing different things. And we still don't understand what a lot of those proteins do. And we need to understand those in order to be able to develop new vaccines and develop new control mechanisms. We've tried all the easy things. We've tried inactivating the virus. We've tried passaging, attenuating the virus, and it doesn't protect. Many groups around the place, including my colleagues at the Institute for Animal Health or Pirbright Laboratory, Pirbright Institute, they've been looking at viral proteins, and of course Spanish researchers as well have been looking at as many viral proteins as possible, identifying them as being potential immunogens, and then putting into various vectors to see whether they're protective both individually and multiply. And although they've got some evidence for partial protection, there's no full protection, so these haven't worked either. A real problem with this is vaccine trials require high containment facilities because this is such a nasty virus. And so this is extremely expensive. And African swine fever virus has been considered to be largely an African problem in the past. So there's not a commercial market for vaccination, and few groups have been involved in research. In fact, the USA is a perfect example that stopped working on African swine fever virus because they didn't see it as a threat and a risk, which was a mistake and something we need to learn from, because we need to be working on these viruses at source, because it's only when we're able to do things with them and stop them at source that we stop them coming to our country. So we need to be forward thinking about this. And the bottom line is more research is needed. We need to understand this virus better. We need to understand this disease better. We need to understand the risk factors better. So the $6 billion question, should you worry about African swine fever virus in the USA? I think I've answered this question for you. The answer is obviously yes. The virus is spreading around the world, and recent weeks have shown how dangerous it is. that it's causing high levels of mortality in pigs, domestic and wild, and there is evidence that the virus may be attenuating in the field, which really does increase the challenges we face with control and prevention. It's a very tough and it's a resistant virus, and it's present in processed meat. And many people coming from infected regions around the world could be carrying the virus with them. The sandwich effect, this has happened before in other countries, such as the previous outbreak in Belgium in 1985 was a piece of pork that came from Spain. And still, sadly, a vaccine is not in sight. So the risk factors that you need to look at in the USA, learning from what's been happening in Europe, is obviously you have wild boar, you have feral pigs. You need to look at these populations and see whether they're capable of transmitting this virus if it got into the USA. Look at your backyard, your outdoor, your wild pigs. Look at the biosecurity. This is where the real risk is. The interaction between backyard, outdoor pigs and wild boar. And this is what's been happening, and this is what's been maintaining the virus in the environment in Europe and Russia. You need to look at whether you have ornithodoros ticks, and critically whether those ornithodoros ticks actually do have contact with pigs, because ornithodoros ticks feed off all sorts of species like birds, and in some cases they will not have contact with ticks, so they're not a worry. But if they do have contact with ticks, the likelihood is they may well maintain the virus for all these many years I was talking about, and they may contribute very significantly to maintaining the virus in the environment if it came in. Levels of biosecurity on domestic pig farms obviously needs to be looked at very carefully. If you have appropriate levels of biosecurity, you can stop this virus getting into to intensive pig farms. It's clear biosecurity is so important. Border security. There's a lot of illegal and sometimes even legal movements of products that potentially have pork in them. And this needs to be looked at very carefully, because this is how the virus is very easily brought in. And the more countries that are infected with African swine fever virus, as we're seeing now, these active outbreaks, and across China, the more likelihood that there are going to be people coming in that maybe have their sandwiches, their pieces of pork. This is a delicacy in so many countries, this smoked or cured pork. And often with delicacies, people take it to family. They transport it to family so they can give it to people who are desperate to have it in their country. And that could have the virus in it. And of course, not to neglect, as I'm a laboratory person, rapid, accurate laboratory diagnosis. It has to be diagnosed quickly, as it's only a very short flight away. And finally, my last slide is really advice to pig farmers in the USA. And this is a case everywhere, not just USA. Biosecurity, biosecurity, biosecurity. Reviewing and increasing existing levels of biosecurity on the farm. As I say, if there's appropriate biosecurity, the virus won't get in. Ensure pigs and wild boar and feral pigs are not fed catering waste, kitchen scraps, or pork products, and do not allow pig meat products onto farms, such as in workers' lunches. It's also really important to ensure that visitors have not had recent contact with affected regions, and anybody returning from infected countries should avoid contact with domestic pigs, with wild boar, with feral pigs, because the virus can be maintained on their clothes, on their shoes for long periods of time. And also, pig farmers should familiarize themselves with the clinical signs of African swine fever. And there are many great videos. There's a really good video if you put African swine fever, EFSA, EU. There's a very nice cartoon type video which shows a lot of the things that I've talked about today, all the transmission cycles. There are other videos on African swine fever virus. You can see all the clinical signs. There's a lot of information out there on the World Wide Web that farmers can look at. So that's a very quick rush through. Thank you very much. I think we need to be afraid. We need to be afraid in all countries, especially where we have large pig industries. We need to up our game, and we need to be prepared. That's the most important thing. So I hope this has helped you to understand how nasty this virus is and what a danger it is. Thank you very much.